So, after Reconstruction, Indian Territory is going to look significantly different. So, let me just give you the time period that we're looking at here. We are looking at 1865 to about 1889. And over the course of these 24 to 25 years, we have a huge change in the population dynamic, especially in terms of race. In terms of non Indians living in Indian territory now, by the end of the Civil War, so by 1865, there are 50,000 uh, Native American people um, uh, living in Indian territory, and are non-Native American peoples living in Indian territory by 1900. So over the course of 35 years, the non-Indian population, specifically white population, is going to increase from 50,000 to 302,000. I'm going to say all of that again just so you understand how quickly and how dramatically that increase is. So in 1865, it's 50,000 non native peoples. By 1900, just white population will be 302,000. So I want to talk about some of the ways that the increase comes in. We talked last in the last lecture about how railroads are going to be a part of that increase, and I want to talk about sort of the partners with railroads that help usher in the white population. One of the things that Oklahoma is really well known for is mineral wealth, right? And when we talk about mineral wealth, one of the things that you have to remember about the American West is that the American West's real mineral wealth is not gold and silver. While gold and silver is going to bring in all of these huge population rushes, gold rushes and silver rushes and all of that stuff, uh, the real mineral wealth of the West, which is what Oklahoma is a Western state, and maybe to be more specific, a Southwestern state. Um, it is its real mineral wealth is going to be in things like oil and coal and other things like that. It's not going to be in gold and silver. And the reason why that's the real mineral wealth is because you can make profit off of those things. Gold and silver is a one time profitable mineral wealth. You can put gold in a bank, store it for a while, turn it into jewelry, trade it in and make profit that one time. But coal, you can, have it in a mine and make it real profitable by selling it to railroads, that sort of thing. It's the same thing with oil. That turns real profit. That you can turn into a real business, right? That can become something that lasts for years and possibly generations. And that's the real mineral wealth of the entire West. And so that's where you're going to see where you have real personal profit come in. And with native peoples, mixed blood peoples are going to come in and make real profit as entrepreneurs. They are going to marry into tribes for the benefit of access to land. Keep in mind that when we're talking about tribes like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, they are going to have ownership and access to resource rich lands. And the only way that outsiders can have access to that land is if they marry into that land, or if they adopt children, or have or become uh you know basically have signed access to land in some kind of way, right? And most people are going to marry into the tribe. And initially, um, the real profitable resource will be coal. And the reason why coal becomes profitable is because of the railroads. Um, the Choctaw, in particular, are going to have access to a tremendous amount of land that is coal rich, right? And the guy who's going to take huge advantage of that is this man pictured here, James J. McAllister. McAllister was from Arkansas, who volunteered for the Confederate Army. Before he was honorably discharged, he became a captain, and he had, during his school days, he had met with an engineer, a guy named Oliver Weldon, and um, he had access to Weldon's memorandum book. And in this book, it detailed coal fields in eastern Oklahoma. And so basically, he used this book to figure out where in eastern Oklahoma the most coal rich fields were. And those coal rich fields just happened to be in Choctaw Nation. So um, McAllister happened to be a mixed blood Native American. He used that to his advantage, and um, use that to basically combine with his own understanding of um, what Eastern Oklahoma had and what the Choctaw Nation had. And let me just add to that, let me go back just a second. He started to go to Choctaw Nation. He was 24 years old, and he started working with trading firms within Choctaw Nation. He started working with these trading firms, and he started buying them out before establishing his own store. And in 1872, he married a Chickasaw woman. Remember, the Chickasaw and the Choctaws worked together a lot. They had their own. They basically, governed together, worked together quite a bit. So in 1872, he marries this woman named Rebecca Burney. Rebecca Burney, Burney, happened to be the sister of a man named Ben Burney. Ben Burney was the future governor of Chickasaw Nation. And marrying uh, Rebecca would give James McAllister full citizenship and therefore full rights in Choctaw and Chickasaw Nation. So, because of this, having full citizenship and full rights, he had access to land ownership. So, whatever land she had, he would have ownership to. And then, of course, he could then own land. Indian citizenship meant that he could stake claim to coal deposits within a 1 mile radius from the point of discovery. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Make sure you write it down. It entitled him to a stake of claim to coal deposits within a 1 mile radius from the point of discovery. Now, remember, he has access to that book that detailed where the coal fields are in eastern Oklahoma. So he knows where the coal is, And now he is married to a woman in the Chickasaw Nation. So he has full tribal citizenship in the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nations, which gives him access to all of this coal rich fields. So this becomes even more important with the arrival of the Katy Railway, which we talked about in the previous lecture. The Katy Railway, of course, is the North-South Railway, which extends from Texas up through Kansas and extends into Missouri. And he establishes what is known as the J.J. McAllister Mercantile Company. It was a coal production company. A part of his company was about coal production, which, of course, coal production was soaring because he just happened to know where all of the coal mines were. So he uh, was able to stake claims to all of these places where the coal deposits were. And then, much later on, years later, when Oklahoma Territory was, let me go back, when Oklahoma Territory was established, so this would be years later, outside of this lecture, years and years later, in 1890, when Oklahoma Territory is established, he would get involved in politics because he is economically um, has the economic advantage. He will also be a leading voice in banking, in business, in law enforcement, in ranching. In 1893, he would be appointed by Grover Cleveland, president at the time, to serve as U.S. Marshal over Indian Territory. He'll only serve as one 4-year term, but one of the things that you have to understand here is that he sets this tone and this established sort of expectation of what it means to have authority and access in the territory, right? That you could marry into a tribe, have access to the land, and therefore the resources in the land. And not only that, you could then have access to power and influence. I want you to remember the story of J.J. McAllister because this is going to carry on further into Oklahoma history, into statehood and the early years of statehood at that. What I want you to remember is that this is going to get progressively worse. And by progressively worse, I mean this is going to lead into what will happen to the elderly among native tribes, as well as Indian children who happen to be orphans. So that's something that I want you to keep in mind as well. In terms of coal mining in general, only a few Native Americans will become coal producers. The real profits of coal mining and coal producing will be railroad companies and other corporations, because what railroad companies will do is they will operate their own mines. They will actually give themselves a steady supply of coal, because what they realize is that when you have guys like a JJ McAllister, he is going to become a middleman, right? And so railroad companies end up having to pay, guys like JJ McAllister for access to coal. Why pay a middleman when you can just own your own coal mine? So railroads operated their own mines. And then they would ship coal to the East Coast and guarantee themselves their own profit, right? So railroad companies such as the Katy Railway, MK&T, they owned the Osage Mining and Coal Company. Other railroads leased, uh, things like 43,000 acres of coal lands. But here's the thing, that land legally belonged to native peoples and tribal nations, but they were controlled by these railroad corporations. Here's how they got around that, because you're thinking, you know, didn't they have treaties signed with the federal government? Yes, they did. Here's how they got around it. In the treaties, what's included in that is that the railroad companies or whatever large corporations, coal companies, whatever, would have to legally pay some leasing fees and have to pay royalties to the tribal nations in order to have access to those resources. Now, here's the problem. The problem is that what those fees were and what the royalties were not set in the treaties. So it's determined essentially by these companies, by these corporations. So they're actually really, really small percentages. And they are paid to the tribal nations and not to the individuals who live on the actual land where these resources are being taken from. So, you might be inconvenienced, but that's your problem. This is all being done for the benefit of the railroad companies. So that's really what's going to take precedent here. Remember, this is going to be in partnership with the federal government. The federal government is looking out for number one. This is going to be for the benefit of Western settlement. This is going to be the benefit of Western expansion. It's not going to be for the benefit of peace in the West. That's the kicker, right? So when you're talking about trying to get access to this coal, that means we're going to have to find people who work in this area, people who work in these coal mines. And that's going to mean bringing in coal miners. 2/3 of the 8,000 miners working in this area were foreign born. And this is by the time 1907 comes around, right? Now, for you guys who are familiar with this, I'm going to bring this up a few times, but we're talking now, we're going to start talking about larger context. So I'm going to need you to, if you're not familiar with this, if you're not comfortable with this, I'm going to need you to start using that American history textbook that you've got. But I need you to familiarize yourself or refamiliarize yourself with the Gilded Age, the 1880s, the 1890s. During this time period, there's going to be a lot of reliance on immigration and immigrant workers who are brought in specifically for the purpose of all of these new industrial jobs that are coming up, right? They are brought in for all of these jobs, and there are millions of people who are brought in from Southern and Eastern European countries, and these jobs are incredibly dangerous, right? There's very little protection for these workers, and coal mining jobs in particular are among the most dangerous. And let me just emphasize, the coal mines in Indian Territory are the most dangerous, are among the most dangerous in the world. In fact, on January 7th, 1892, there's a coal mine explosion where 150 workers are hurt, 87 end up dead. And as you hopefully remember, if not, your textbook, your American history textbook might tell you, in the Gilded Age, the United States will lead the world in hurt in injuries and deaths among industrialized countries, among workers. That's the thing. There is really no care for worker safety, because the number one priority is not worker safety; it's profit. The other thing that I want you to keep in mind is that coal mining is not the only kind of mines that we have here in Indian Territory, and it's not the only kind of mines that we have in the American West. There is also zinc and there are lead mines. The zinc and the lead mines will bring in thousands more um, non-native peoples, right? Thousands more workers means the establishment of what's known as boom towns. These boom towns are essentially called that because of the population booms that take place. The population booms are these sudden, overnight um population booms that take place because of the workers that just show up for the work that's available. They show up um just to be able to work and work as much as they can and settle in the area. Whether or not they're going to stay there for long term is entirely up to them. Most of them do not. But it's entirely, essentially, these towns that are occupied mostly for the work. Um, in terms of how rich these lands are, in the tri state district, by tri state district, I mean Missouri, Kansas, and Oklahoma, uh, Indian Territory serves as the richest single area of hard rock mining. So it's incredibly profitable uh, to be here. It is incredibly profitable to be here. That's why there is such a massive non native population boom here. And by non native, I want to make sure you understand the emphasis here is primarily going to be white. There is a huge immigrant population boom here, but it is very much white. Let me also emphasize here that there is a black population movement here, but in terms of employment opportunity, let me just say the black employment opportunity does not exist. Black employment opportunity is not available here because they are black. And so black Americans have to essentially commune with each other. They have to, it's a part of the reason why they have to settle amongst themselves, live in and settle in black communities, create their own businesses, create their own areas, establish their own economies, because they are not hired by these railroad companies, these coal mining companies. Instead, these jobs go to immigrants and that sort of thing. When we talk about um, the concern here, or the change here, it is really with the white population coming in and challenging the native population. right? So I want to talk about how the tribal population sort of adjusts to this or tries to adjust. So I want to talk about the Cherokees first. So the Cherokees, after the railroads start to come in, um, looking at the provisions of their Reconstruction treaty, the Reconstruction Treaty for them contains a provision that exempted tobacco products that had been manufactured in the Cherokee Nation from the federal revenue tax. So I'm going to say that again. I'm going to explain what it means. So the Cherokee Nation had um, been making profits and doing very well from producing tobacco. And one of the things that they had successfully negotiated is that they continue to produce tobacco and not be taxed on those products. So Elias Boudinot and Stand Watie, pictured here. So Elias Boudinot is in the top right in the black suit, and Stand Watie is the older gentleman in the bottom picture. The two of them built a factory and manufactured tobacco plugs that were sold in the States. And of course, because they are tobacco products, these tobacco products were not taxed. Their competitors complained and then filed a lawsuit. And so a federal district court ruled that Boudinot and Stand Watie were in violation of an 1868 federal revenue law that had taxed tobacco, and ordered that the tobacco factory be seized. And so these two men, of course, you know, complained, um, saying, well, we actually have a treaty that says we've we can actually produce tobacco and it not be taxed. So they appealed the decision and it went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld the ruling of the federal district court. And so um this is incredibly problematic, right? And so uh government officials refused to deal with this, and a few refused to negotiate these treaties, um, to renegotiate these treaties with these Indian nations. And that's really what came into question. Everything had been done by Washington officials. So in 1889, a new U.S. federal district court was established in Muskogee. Other courts soon followed. Um, and essentially, corporations bribed tribal officials to allow them to ignore tribal laws. So you've got these corporations who are basically saying, "Hey, we'll pay you under the table to ignore tribal laws. We'll pay you a little extra. Ignore tribal laws, ignore tribal sovereignty, and just let us, you know, get around things." Um, and this becomes really problematic because essentially what they're doing, before I get to the potential territory, essentially what they're doing is they're saying what we want to do is we want to ignore those treaties that we've signed with you in 1866 with Reconstruction. We just want to forget that we did this and move on from that. What ends up happening is the federal government comes in and says, look, we've brought in railroad companies, we've brought in coal mining companies, we've brought in all of these white people. we're taking over the area anyway. Why don't you guys, because it's just easier to do this, why don't you guys, you 5 tribes, form a single territorial government and make it easier on us, so that we negotiate with all of you all at once, because it's really sort of, it's a little bit annoying that we've got to negotiate with you one at a time. um and, what if you have a case, and you make it all the way to the Supreme Court, and then we've got to do something with somebody else, and we don't want to do that anymore. We're going to ask you to form a single territorial government. um and they did this in Arizona. um this is, and quite frankly, they were doing this in New Mexico as well. Why don't you guys do the same thing? You can form a single territorial government and call it Oklahoma. So the potential territory issue comes up. The intertribal councils established, um you know, they had met regularly at the Creek Capitol building in Okmulgee. Anyway, they were meeting regularly after 1868. And in 1817, they had established a constitution and Bill of Rights, because what they were hoping for was a future Indian state, not an American state. They were hoping that Indian Territory would become an Indian state. And Washington was like, no, we don't. I mean, we're glad that you wrote a constitution. It's nice that you've written a Bill of Rights. That's nice. That's cute. But the problem is that it's too Indian. It's too Indian sovereignty. It's too much Indian independence. And that's going to hinder your development, and uh we don't want to promote that sort of thing. And quite frankly, we need to take advantage of all of the resources you had. Now, let me put a pause in that and just say, think back to 70 years prior to this, or to 1803, when you've got the Lewis and Clark expedition, or even 3 years after that, when you've got the Weir expeditions or whatever. And all of these guys come out here and say, there is nothing here. It is a waste of space. Stick the Indians here and let them rot, that sort of thing. And now there's the realization that you have all of this possible profit to be made, right? And what happens here instead is that with this potential territory, with the idea of establishing this so-called territorial government, it is a result not only in the loss of sovereignty, it's the loss of land, because the government wants access to resources, right? So this is the problem here. The federal government had been incrementally doing this for years. When we go back in previous lectures and talk about um using federal courts to come in and make sure that law enforcement was being exercised, and the law was being upheld, so that criminality was trying to be maintained or kept at a minimum. Or you had the loss of land after the Reconstruction treaties, or the introduction of the railroads, and all of these things. All of that were signs that this was all inevitable. That's the main thing, right? So, what essentially is starting to make way here is you have slowly but surely, you are making the way for the establishment of two territories, because you are going to have uh, these territories where you are going to have uh, an Oklahoma territory and an Indian territory. The territories themselves are going to be split between where the native peoples of the southeastern tribes had been living, which is considered Indian territory. And I'll get my pen out here. So this area right here had been where the southeastern tribes had been living the entire time. And then this area had been delegated for where the other tribes of the plains had been removed to, right? So you'll notice in this smaller map here that I've included that, and it's hard and it's a little hard to see, but you'll notice that there are the unassigned lands. So here are the unassigned lands, but you also have the Osage here. You've got the Kaw peoples living here. The Cherokee outlet still lives here, but that's going to be opened up soon. Technically no man's land, but that will be opened up as well. Grazing lands, which will be opened up. The Kiowa, Comanche, and Apache live here. The Cheyenne and Arapaho live here. That will be opened up soon. Greer County will be, which has always been available at some point. But when you look at it in a large way, in a larger situation, the left hand side of the state, of the now state, is Oklahoma territory, and this is Indian territory. This is where the southeastern tribes are, and this is where everybody else is. And when we talk about the why it is split that way, what the federal government will argue is well, we've kept our word to the southeastern tribes. We've allowed them to have their own space. We've kept up our end of the bargain. They still have their own territory, but look at how small the Seminole lands have shrunk. That's where the Seminole live, in this small tab of lands. And the Cherokee now are reduced to that little bit of land. I mean, when we talk about the reduction in land and why it's gotten that small, it's essentially to make way for inevitably what was always going to happen, and that was for the federal takeover of Indian territory.